Now let's take a look at your overhead recovery systems. Overhead recovery, coming out of your budget, is a mathematical system, so a formula basically, for marking up your cost of goods, the things that you do estimate, to make sure that the prices that you charge for those things recover your company's overhead. And there's a couple of different methods LMN uses, so we'll take a look at each method, we'll explain how they work, and then you can decide which method best suits your business. Here I am in the budget, and I'm going to get to my overhead recovery tab by clicking here, the OH recovery tab part of the budget. You'll notice on this screen that there are 3 different overhead recovery methods listed. Now you can use any one of these, and you can choose which one you want to use by clicking the Activate button. By clicking Activate, for instance, on field labor hour recovery, you'll notice this now turns green, the checkbox goes here, and this is activated, meaning this is the overhead recovery method we're going to use when we estimate our work. Now before we get too deep into the overhead recovery methods, let's take a look at each one. We're going to start from the bottom up though, because the bottom is the simplest one, and we'll work our way up to the more complicated one. The single overhead recovery method is the last method shown on this screen. And the formula to figure it out is quite simple. First, it reads your company's overhead costs, and that's coming from your overhead budget. So what that includes is all the overhead expenses that you put in, all the overhead wages that you put in, and all the overhead equipment that you put in to your overhead budget. These are all the expenses that you don't estimate, but you need to recover. Then what it does is take a look at all your estimated costs, and it gets this number, this forecast job costs, by looking at your total labor, equipment, materials, and subs. So we add all those together and we come up with a total forecast job costs. Now all we do is divide the overhead costs by the forecast job costs to come up with a percentage. Now what this percentage, and in my case it says 31.2% on my screen, what that's saying is overhead costs are approximately, or at least on average, 31.2% of job costs. So now when we're estimating, the formula is pretty simple. You work out the cost of the job on the estimate, you add 31.2%, and that's how you figure out how much overhead that bid needs to recover. It's a very simple method, it works well, and it works especially well for businesses in retail. But it's not a great system to use for companies doing construction or landscape maintenance work. The reason is, it has the same overhead markup no matter what the cost is. So for instance, if the job cost is a labor item, it's going to mark that up by 31.2%. If the job cost is a material item, it'll also mark that up by 31.2%. If the job cost is a subcontractor item, it will also count on 31.2% markup for overhead. Now that should start to raise some warning bells with you. If you could mark up your subcontractors by the same markup as you could mark up your labor, you probably wouldn't have much labor. You'd lean on using subs as often as possible. Typically, labor gets a much higher markup than subcontractors. Subcontractors usually has a very lean markup. You can say the same thing for materials. Labor is a lot harder to manage than materials are. So why would I want to have the same markup on labor as I would materials? If you have a higher markup on labor and a lower markup on materials, you're more likely to win jobs with a lot of materials. And those jobs are a lot easier to manage and run than jobs with a lot of labor. If labor is our hardest resource to find, keep, train, retain, and all that kind of stuff, then I certainly want to try to lean my company towards jobs that don't need a lot of labor, because that's the hardest thing to find and manage in this industry. I'd rather win more jobs with more materials, more equipment, and more subcontracting. And these are the things that the other estimating methods or the other overhead recovery methods will help us accomplish. So let's move one up and take a look at the field labor hour method. The field labor hour method says labor is the toughest thing to manage, and so therefore we're going to recover all our company's overhead on our labor. And what it works out is an overhead markup per hour for your field labor. So you start with your forecast overhead costs, and then you divide those by the field labor hours in your budget. That's why it was important even for salaried staff in the field labor section to enter their actual hours. Because what we can arrive at now is how much overhead per man hour we need to add to our estimates. Adding this overhead recovery method is simple now to jobs. You simply calculate how many man hours you've estimated on the job. In my case, I'm going to add $14.85 an hour because that's how much my overhead markup is based on these numbers here. And if we do that all year and sell all the labor hours that we budgeted, we should be able to recover all our overhead. So this method we consider superior to single overhead recovery factor because this method takes into account that labor is more difficult and it's in fact going to dump all your overhead on labor. One of the other methods that's really common in the landscape and construction industry is the multiple overhead recovery method. Now, this is the more complicated method, but some would argue it's the most accurate. The multiple overhead recovery method is a little more complicated to explain, but here's how it works. You start with your overhead costs, and again, that's coming from your overhead budget. Then there's an industry standard overhead markup on subs, and when you're looking at these numbers, we want to be crystal clear. These are not the markups including profit. These are strictly for overhead. So when you see a 5% overhead markup on subs, we don't mean that's going to be our final price. We just mean we're going to mark up the cost of subs by 5% simply to recover overhead. Profit will come over and above these markups. So subs get a very small markup because typically subs have a small markup. So there's a 5% markup on your subcontractor costs to recover overhead. So behind the scenes, what LMN's doing is looking at your subcontracting budget here, figuring out how much estimated subcontracting work you're going to do, and then applying 5% of that to recover part of your overhead budget. And then the same thing with materials. So it's going to count on a 10% markup to recover overhead from materials. Again, that's not including profit, that's just for overhead. But if my materials budget is then $318,000, what it's counting on is going to be about $31,800 in overhead recovery from materials if we mark our materials up by 10% for overhead. Now, equipment is a little trickier to manage than materials or subs, so it gets a slightly higher percentage. You've got to store it at the yard, you've got to repair it, inspect it, maintain it, etc. So because it takes a little more overhead to manage equipment's markup is higher, and it's 25%. So again, it looks at your equipment cost, the equipment that you put in your cost of goods sold, the stuff that you will estimate, and says if we mark these costs up by 25%, we're going to recover that amount towards overhead as well. Now, labor is the tricky one. It's the one you can't change. You can change these methods here. So if you would rather a higher markup on subs, you can do that, and you'll see my labor drops. Or a higher markup on materials, you can see that, my labor drops again. Some companies use a method called double overhead recovery that only recovers overhead on materials and labor. And in that case, you can certainly make LMN work for that by zeroing out the equipment, increasing the markup on material, and zeroing out subs. And then you'll get your two markups for labor and materials. So it's quite flexible in what it can do. But the industry standard markups for labor, for material, and for subs look like that. And what you're left over with, if we're going to recover some of our overhead from subs based on this markup, and some of our overhead from materials based on this markup, and some of our overhead from equipment based on this markup, whatever overhead is left can only come from one place. The last cost of goods sold remaining is labor. So to work out your markup on labor, what it does is divide the remaining overhead by the total cost of your field labor to come up with a labor markup. So what I end up now is 4 different overhead markup percentages, one for labor, one for equipment, one for materials, and one for subs. So arguably, this is the most complicated method. But there are those who would argue it's also the most accurate. If a job has a lot of labor, it's probably going to be more expensive because your markup on labor is higher than any of your other costs. If the job has a lot of materials and subs, well, I'm going to be able to come in at a very competitive price because my markup on these two things is low. Now, again, just to remind you, these are all before profit. We're going to add profit on top of these markups. But you should be able to see now that a job with labor would get 5 times the markup of a job for with lots of materials for overhead. And that makes sense because labor takes a lot more effort and manpower to manage the materials. We can order $10,000 worth of materials in a few phone calls, but managing $10,000 worth of labor is a lot more work. So the multiple overhead recovery method is designed to make jobs with labor or lots of labor more expensive because the markup is higher. And jobs with lots of materials and subs will be less expensive because our markup is lower. And ideally, that should help steer your company into the kind of jobs that you'll probably find are the most profitable. Jobs that push more materials, more subs, more equipment, and less reliance on manpower. If you can build a company like that, you'll find it a lot easier to grow as you're less reliant, less dependent on finding, training, keeping labor. Now, all that said, you can choose whatever overhead recovery method you'd like to use. To activate a recovery method, simply click the Activate button and then save your budget. From that point forward, any new estimates built based on this budget are going to use that overhead recovery. Note that if you've already built some estimates using this budget, changing the overhead recovery factor here is not going to change the price on the estimate. That's going to stay locked in based on what this was at the time you built the estimate. But if I change it now, anything going forward is going to use that overhead recovery method to calculate how much overhead each estimate should recover. And because you've got your budget, where your overhead forecast is built in here, as long as you hit your sales goals, and as long as you charge what LMN tells you need to charge in terms of markups, you should be able to recover the overhead that you budgeted. Overhead can be a tricky topic, and that's just a nutshell to try to explain briefly how overhead recovery works in LMN. If you have any questions, you're unsure about something, by all means reach out to us at support@golmn.com, and we'll try to help you explain your numbers in terms of overhead recovery.